A kidnapped UN peacekeeper may be the first to die in a new round of Middle East terror. A pro-Iranian group says it hanged U.S. Marine Colonel William Higgins, and another group threatens to kill another American tomorrow unless Israel releases a Muslim leader. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Good evening. President Bush cut off a political domestic tour today and rushed back to the White House to deal with the first Middle East crisis of his presidency. This morning, a pro-Iranian group in Beirut said it had executed an American hostage, Marine Colonel William Higgins. It released a crude and grisly videotape, which it said showed the hanging, but the videotape left many questions unanswered. A few hours later, another pro-Iranian group set a new deadline for another American hostage. A group calling itself the Revolutionary Justice Organization said it would carry out a death sentence tomorrow against American Joseph Scipio unless Israel releases a kidnapped Muslim leader. The group sent a photo of the hostage. Bob Simon in Israel begins our report.
The grisly footage was accompanied by a statement saying that Colonel Higgins had been killed to punish the United States and Israel for not releasing Sheikh Abdul Karim Obeid, kidnapped by Israeli commandos last Friday. But you could not tell from the tape when Higgins had in fact died. Israeli officials were hoping today that it can be established that Higgins was murdered some time ago, thus severing any possible connection between his death and the Israeli raid. CBS News has learned that Defense Minister Rabin proposed the raid 3 weeks ago, that it was approved by the Israeli cabinet with one dissenting vote and received the full support of the Israeli army. The objective was to acquire bargaining chips to free 2 Israeli prisoners in Lebanon. American hostages did not enter into the scheme at all. The Israelis did not consult Washington. They did not believe they had to because they did not see an American angle. Tonight, Israeli officialdom is in a state of utter embarrassment. Foreign Minister Moshe Aarons is leading a defensive action designed to put the blame squarely on the pro-Iranian militants in Lebanon.
They are the only ones to blame for these kind of acts, and the civilized world simply has to ask itself how it is best to fight this kind of terrible criminal action.
To blame Jerusalem, Israelis say, would be to give the terrorists a double victory.
This is exactly what the terrorists are looking for, to put a wedge between the Israelis and the Americans.
Privately, Israeli officials admit the tactical victory they won last Friday has already yielded a strategic defeat. With more death threats from Beirut tonight, there's an atmosphere of deepening gloom here as Israelis become more and more concerned that this dreadful week may have just begun. Bob Simon, CBS News, Tel Aviv.
President Bush arrived back in Washington this afternoon. He flew in from Chicago after his speech to the National Governors Association. He canceled trips to Oklahoma and Nevada. Chief White House correspondent Leslie Stahl is with the president. Leslie?
Dan, actually, I'm on the lawn. He's inside holding a series of meetings with his national security advisors and with the bipartisan congressional leadership. CBS has been told by sources here that there is no rescue operation on the table because, and let me quote, "we don't know where the other hostages are." And there is no military strike on the table because, quote, "we can't blow up a whole city looking for just one guy."
But the president is under incredible pressure to do something, not only because of Higgins, but because the White House takes very seriously the threat to execute a second American tomorrow.
I know I speak for all here when I try to express to the American people the sense of outrage that we all feel about this kind of brutality, this uncalled for terrorism.
Faced with frustratingly few options, the administration instead is focused on criticizing and pressuring Israel, whose raid into Lebanon last week may have triggered Higgins' execution.
Kidnapping and violence is not something that the United States agrees with.
I can tell you that we did not know it was taking place.
Senator Dole, reflecting the thinking of some top officials in the administration, went even further.
Can't continually apologize for Israeli actions, and perhaps a little more responsibility on the part of the Israelis one of these days would be refreshing.
The kind of criticism that Israel is to blame, that Israel should not have done this, will give solace to one group, and that's Hezbollah.
Flying home today, President Bush telephoned Colonel Higgins' wife.
Wonderfully stoic individual who is going through sheer hell.
the president may be going through his own hell. He raised expectations that he would take some kind of action when he cut his trip short today. He is facing the possibility of new executions, something new in this long hostage ordeal, Dan, that has already wounded 2 American presidents. Dan?
Thank you, Leslie. Colonel Higgins' wife, Robin, is a major in the Marine Corps and works as an information officer at the Pentagon. CBS News Pentagon correspondent David Martin reports on her reaction and what her colleagues inside the Defense Department make of the situation tonight.
This was the last time Rich Higgins was known to be alive, a videotape released shortly after his capture. Since then, there have been several threats that he was about to be executed, including once after the cruiser Vincennes accidentally shot down an Iranian airliner. His wife, Robin Higgins, watched today's videotape, but her attorney read a statement on her behalf saying she still is not sure whether he is alive or dead.
I have seen the reports and have not reached any conclusion myself. One thing I have learned over the past 17 months is that the truth is hard to find, and it remains so.
U.S. intelligence believes Higgins was held for a while in the town of Jibshit and actually interrogated by Sheikh Obeid, the Muslim leader kidnapped by Israelis. U.S. intelligence subsequently received reports that Higgins had been moved to Beirut and even pinpointed his location in a building across the street from a graveyard. Pentagon officials discussed with then-President Reagan the possibility of attempting to rescue Higgins and even dispatched agents into Beirut in preparation for a possible mission. But eventually the mission was scrubbed. The intelligence was too uncertain to justify the risk.
It's possible Robin Higgins knows in her heart of hearts the man in today's videotape is her husband and just can't bring herself to admit it. Other people who knew Rich Higgins and have seen today's videotape all agree it looks like him, but say they cannot be absolutely sure. David Martin, CBS News, The Pentagon.
8 other Americans are still being held by various pro-Iranian groups in Lebanon. The longest held is correspondent Terry Anderson of the Associated Press, who was kidnapped in 1985. Today's reported execution was a bitter reminder to their families, friends, and colleagues of the danger they face every day in captivity. Bruce Morton has more about that.
The United Nations marked the possible murder of one of its own by adopting a resolution opposing hostage taking.
15 votes in favor, no votes against.
Colonel Higgins' family could only wait and hope.
You never go a day without thinking about him, wondering what's happening to him and, if he will get home.
Outside Thomas Sicipio's house, his brother Joseph is a hostage now threatened. Signs commemorate the Americans in captivity. For all their families, today was new pain in an old wound. Sicipio has been a prisoner for almost 3 years.
Right now, I'm thinking about tomorrow, and I'm thinking about what's going on now with our government.
Terry Anderson has been a hostage for 4.5 years. His sister hopes his kidnappers will accept the Israeli offer of a swap. All of ours for all of yours.
My hope, my prayer is that they respond in a positive way to the Israeli offer and that the Israelis do not withdraw it.
Jesse Turner has been a hostage for more than 2.5 years. His mother thinks Israel did wrong.
The trouble of it is, it's not Israel that's being punished for it. It's us.
Father Lawrence Jenko, freed in 1986 after more than 18 months' captivity, says the Israelis and the Shiites are all terrorists, all wrong.
I consider all of them to be violent people. I consider all of them to be acts of terrorism. They can do all the manipulation they wish about words and commandos or kidnappers. It's still acts of violence, acts of terrorism.
It is an old wound, an aching wound. It never seems to heal. Bruce Morton, CBS News, Washington.
Coming up next, I'll be back to discuss today's Middle East developments with 4 of our veteran correspondents, so stay here with us. Left a host of questions unanswered tonight. We've gathered CBS News correspondents in Israel and Washington to try to get a handle on some of those questions. Bob Simon is standing by in Tel Aviv. Leslie Stahl is at the White House. David Martin is at the Pentagon, and Bill Plant at the State Department. The first question, perhaps, is the one left unanswered by that grisly, terrible videotape released today in Beirut. What are the chances that Colonel Higgins may still be alive? And if he's dead, what are the chances he's been dead for some time? David?
Dan, as to when Higgins might have died, it really still is a guessing game.
Pentagon officials are hoping to get their hands on the original of the videotape. We've all been watching dubs on television. Get their hands on the original and massage it electronically, and perhaps that will tell them when the tape was made.
Bob Simon?
Dan, Israeli television just reported that a reliable Shiite source in Beirut reports that Colonel Higgins has been dead for some time, that he died under torture when his captors tried to make him confess that he was an American spy. Clearly, this version suits the Israelis more than the story that Higgins was killed today. The Israelis are afraid that the truth will never be known.
Now, another key question is whether the Israeli kidnap raid into Lebanon, the one reported on Friday, has backfired. Did that set off a new round of terror? Bob Simon?
Dan, Israeli exuberance last Friday when they'd executed what they perceived as another brilliant raid worthy of Entebbe, that exuberance changed to desperation in one instant today. Israeli ministers, the same ones who approved the raid, are now confessing that they probably got into something too quickly without assessing all the risks.
Bill Plant, the view from the State Department on that.
Dan, to say that the administration is upset over this is to put it mildly. Furious would not be too strong a word, although not on the record. The U.S. ambassador in Jerusalem went to the Israelis today with U.S. concerns that this will just lead to an escalating cycle of violence against the other hostages, whether or not Colonel Higgins was dead for some time. And in fact, after he delivered that message, the threat came out against Joseph Scipio.
Bob Simon, what are the chances that the Israelis will decide to release the sheikh they kidnapped?
Dan, they won't do it on their own. That would be knuckling under to terrorism. That's their phrase. If Washington were to ask the Israelis to return the sheikh, it's clear from talking to officials here tonight that that request would receive very serious consideration.
And now we have this new threat to Joseph Scipio and all of the U.S. hostages. What's the chance that more Americans will be killed? Bill Plant?
Well, Dan, the threat is being taken very seriously here. Officials believe that it's entirely possible that the threat will be carried out, especially since there seems to be no way to bring any pressure on the groups holding the hostages, particularly even by the larger powers such as Iran.
Now, what can the United States do to end this crisis, if anything? What options are available to Washington? David Martin?
Well, Dan, there's no military option that's at least being seriously considered. There's an aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean that gets underway from Egypt tomorrow. There's a marine amphibious ready group that's south of Crete. But absent some better information about where the hostages are, where the other 8 Americans are, not to mention all the Western European hostages, there just is not what looks like a good military option.
Leslie Stahl?
Well, Dan, you know, the president is meeting with congressional bipartisan leaders. They are being briefed by CIA Director Webster to explain to them the limited options they have, no military options. And he's hoping they'll come out and sort of remove some of the pressure on the president right now to retaliate. The only option right now is diplomatic, and the president himself has to decide what Bob Simon was talking about. Does he allow the Israelis to hang tough and hold on to this sheikh, or does he do what President Reagan always said he wouldn't do, and that is call on the Israelis to release this sheikh to stop what is looking like a possible escalation, as you say, of the terrorism and the killings?
Very quickly, Leslie, what about those so-called moderates in Iran that we've been trying to accommodate all this time?
Well, what the White House said today is we have never understood how much influence the Iranians have over these groups, particularly the Hezbollah that the sheikh belongs to. We know they have some, but we're unsure if they have complete control. The president did send a message to Iran over the weekend saying that the United States would look very unfavorably on any action against Colonel Higgins, but it's unclear whether they're holding the Iranians responsible at this point.
Thank you, Leslie Stahl, Bob Simon, David Martin, and Bill Plant. I'll be back with the day's other news coming up next. And a new federal drug abuse survey out tonight. Indications are that casual drug use may be going down, but as CBS News correspondent Mark Phillips reports, hardcore cocaine, especially crack, cocaine addiction, death, and violence are still spiraling up.
It's a scorecard in the war on drugs, but it's unclear who's winning.
Of course, these numbers are still much too high.
The numbers are high, but they're dropping. In 1985, 23 million Americans admitted to using illegal drugs. Last year, the number was down to 14.5 million, a drop of 37%.
There is still a long way to go.
But on a number of fronts in the war on drugs, we have moved from defense to offense.
Even the use of cocaine, once the boutique drug of choice among the rich and famous, was down 50%, from 5.8 million to 2.9 million users. Why? Perhaps because the Just Say No campaign is working.
It's called cocaine, and it can do the same thing to you.
Middle-class Americans who turn to bran muffins because they think it's healthier are simply not going to take a drug that looks as if it's very dangerous.
But along with the very good news came the very bad. Those who do use cocaine use more of it, and many of those users are poor and black or Hispanic. From about 650,000 people who use cocaine at least once a week in 1985, there are now 862,000, an increase of 33%. And the result?
Drug crime is up, drug trafficking is up, drug deaths are up, drug emergencies in our hospitals are up.
Just Say No is fine for kids who have most things working for them. It doesn't work for kids who are up against it.
And that's the dilemma. Current programs may be keeping more people off drugs, but in dealing with the hardcore drug user, they've hit a dead end. Mark Phillips, CBS News, Washington.
Number one Citibank and other major banks today cut their key prime lending rate half a point down to 10.5%. All went against baseball's Pete Rose today in his legal battle over gambling allegations. Frank Courier has our report.
As Pete Rose and his injury-riddled Reds struggle out of their worst slump in 23 years, the beleaguered manager suffered a bigger loss in court today. A federal judge in Columbus ruled that Rose's legal battle with baseball belongs in U.S. District Court. Judge John Holshoe said plaintiff Rose and defendant Giamatti are the real parties in this case, not the Cincinnati Reds or baseball. A month of legal maneuvering has kept the baseball commissioner from deciding whether Rose gambled on Reds games.
I think they're trying to avoid the decision by the commissioner and, of course, drag it out as long as they can.
Today's jurisdictional ruling is a victory for baseball because time and again federal judges have upheld the sweeping powers of the baseball commissioner. If and when any court decides Rose's fate, his lawyers will be counting on the testimony of a former prisoner. 24-year-old Scott Estes, convicted of filing a false consumer product report, told investigators that a fellow prisoner bragged about framing Rose in a gambling conspiracy.
He lied to Sports Illustrated. He lied to Major League Baseball investigators. And he lied to the grand jury in Cincinnati.
He's talking about Michael Fry, a convicted drug dealer who during his term at this Indiana federal prison, Estes says, planned the conspiracy to impress investigators and shorten his term.
He didn't know if Pete Rose gambled or not. He didn't know any of this stuff. And yet he's told everybody, yeah.
Rose, meanwhile, whose fifth-place Reds have dropped 31 of their last 45 games, agrees he was framed and never bet on baseball.
I will vindicate myself. I mean, when given the opportunity, I will vindicate myself.
Given 10 days to file an appeal, Rose keeps the best job security guarantee in pro sports, protected by court order from being disciplined by baseball or fired by the Cincinnati Reds. Frank Courier, CBS News, Chicago.
The first hurricane of the season formed today in the Gulf of Mexico and is heading for the coast of Texas. The mayor of Grand Isle, Louisiana, called for evacuation of the low-lying barrier island. Forecasters expect the newborn hurricane to hit land tomorrow in the vicinity of Beaumont, Texas.
We're here to gently remind you that you can depend on your mom.
Phillips Milk of Magnesia, the laxative for dependable overnight relief that contains no harsh irritants.
So it's gentle.
Nobody treats you better than Phillips Milk of Magnesia.
Mom knows best. Leave it to Mom.
Rich stain and tough polyurethane protection in one. Poly Shades by Minwax. Get a beautiful finish in half the time. A finish to be proud of. Poly Shades by Minwax.
It was big.
Yeah, big.
I mean big.
It was big. It was very, very big. But it was easy.
It's GM's biggest summer sale with cashbacks and dealer incentives on more cars and trucks than ever.
This is big. Really big. I know big. And this was big.
GM's Big Easy Sale. Over $1 billion big.
It was big. It was so big.
But it was easy.
Now at your GM dealer. Right now.
Do you like Raisin Bran? Yes, I do. Well, this is new Total Raisin Bran.
It tastes just as good as your Raisin Bran, but it has 4 times the vitamin nutrition. So can you think of one single reason why Total Raisin Bran shouldn't be your Raisin Bran? No hurry, got plenty of time.
A custody battle may be the most traumatic and rancorous experience a divorcing couple can go through. The custody battle about to erupt in a Tennessee state court will be all of that and more. Medical correspondent Susan Spencer tells us about a case that's entering uncharted territory of ethics and law.
In the 9 years of their marriage, Mary and Junior Davis tried desperately to have children, turning, as hundreds of couples do each year, to in vitro fertilization. Today, the result of their high-tech efforts to conceive is the subject of a raging divorce battle, likely to make medical and legal history. Frozen in liquid nitrogen, 7 human eggs, fertilized in a laboratory. They could be thawed, implanted, and possibly grow into a fetus, then a baby, which is what Junior Davis emphatically does not want, and what Mary Davis is insisting on.
She'd like to have 1 child, maybe 2, no more. Then the remaining embryos would be donated to some infertile couple.
We say that at this point, Mr. Davis should retain the right to decide if he'll be a father, because he is not a father today.
At the heart of the argument is what doctors call a pre-embryo, a few cells containing genetic material 1/10 of the size of a grain of sugar. They're stored in this building, right where Mr. Davis wants to keep them. He isn't asking that they be destroyed, only that they not be implanted in anyone, least of all his estranged wife.
I hope that this case will recognize that men have equal rights to the decision to become a parent that women have.
I think he would have had to run in the lab and say, "Doctor, don't put my sperm in that petri dish." I think it's there was when his decision was made.
Meanwhile, Mary Davis's biological clock is ticking.
If the woman in this case does not get access to the eggs, she won't have any other opportunities because there's no fertility clinic in the country that does in vitro fertilization for single women.
Nor, unfortunately for the Davises, do clinics routinely require couples to agree beforehand what happens to fertilized eggs if they divorce. Louisiana prohibits their destruction, but no state has decided if they should be treated as property, potential children, or something else.
I'm troubled by the fact that I don't have any guidance to help me ferret out the right decision in this case.
There may be no absolute right decision for the Davises, but with thousands of pre-embryos in storage around the country, more cases like this seem inevitable until law and ethics catch up with technology. Susan Spencer, CBS News, Washington.
And that's part of our world tonight. Dan Rather for the CBS Evening News. Stay tuned to this station for any hostage developments. Good night.
I'm Harry Smith.
And I'm Kathleen Sullivan. How can we win the war against drugs tomorrow? Drug czar William Bennett.
Also, the great B.B. King tomorrow on CBS This Morning.
These 2 suits